Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And now, right before we move on to our final and third plenary session of MWGF 2020, I'd like to remind all of you joining us on live on our Facebook at UNFPA Malaysia. Leave us your comments, leave us your thoughts, tweet at us. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're really looking forward to continuing this. We have the resolutions of MWGF 2020 and the path forward for gender equality for Malaysia in 2021 coming up at the end of today's proceedings. And all of that is actually garnered through your feedback. It is absolutely collaborative over here. So, very swiftly now, I am going to actually introduce and hand over the third plenary session, which is all about gender equality, the role of Malaysian men and boys, and the media, to our panel moderator, Aina Fadzil, who is the head of public relations with dearHER. Hello, Aina.
Hi, Tamina. Thank you so much.
Fantastic to have you with us, Aina. Aina, the floor is now yours. Please take it away.
Thank you, Tamina. Hi, everyone. My name is Aina, and I will be your moderator today for this topic of gender equality, the role of Malaysian men and the media. As COVID-19 continues to affect lives and livelihoods around the world, we can already see that the pandemic and its economic fallout are having a regressive effect on gender equality. So today, we have for you speakers with vast knowledge on the subject matter. I'm here to introduce the first speaker for today, Mr. Zurairi AR, who is the assistant news editor for Malay Mail, a freelance researcher and an advocate for free thought. He will be speaking more on the influence of men in the newsroom and media industry. Hi, Mr. Zurairi.
Hi, Aina. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here.
So, Mr. Zurairi, I want to ask your opinion on how gender equality affects the media and also how it affects newsroom and the issues that comes from that.
Okay. Well, I do not have the official statistic to back my claim, but anecdotally, it does feel like the majority of Malaysian newsrooms, especially in the top management, top editorial decision making, are disproportionately dominated by men. In the times when I have attended media briefings for senior editors held by the government, those who attended were overwhelmingly men, which I have to admit included myself. And when in many publications, even when women hold top positions, such as section editors, they tend to be appointed positions reserved for what we call soft news, such as lifestyle or entertainment desk. Not to say that these sections are less important, but they are admittedly not as influential or in shaping public opinions and government policies compared to, for example, say the news desk. And sometimes even despite being heads of such sections, they are not even considered in decision making in an organizations. So when newsrooms are dominated by men, there is this sort of like a boys club mentality, which are set in older and more patriarchal journalistic tropes, traditions and mentalities, and inevitably this can result in the gender bias, not only in publishing stories but also in hiring. This can include, for example, sexist and demeaning headlines, copy, misogynist angling of stories, inappropriate choice of photos and advertisements, lack of female representatives when it comes to newsmakers, and also on issues that dominantly affect women. And especially my own pet peeve, which is misgendering of trans women, transgender, intersex, and non-binary persons. There may also be a lack of awareness on how certain stories can enable and even promote physical and especially online gender-based violence against women, such as harassment, death, or rape threats on social media, and the practice of doxing, where people reveal who you are, where you live, all your personal details out in the public. Examples of these include stories which can carry sometimes judgmental or critical slant towards women who are perceived of not being fit into this sort of like patriarchal view of how women should behave. Like, every year we have harassment against participants of Women's March Malaysia. And sometimes we have very judgmental stories when, for example, female artists discard their hijab, or coverage on prominent intersex or transgender women celebrities, such as, for example, when cosmetics entrepreneur Sajat went on Umrah. Simply many of these issues can be nipped in the bud if only we have a more diverse team of editors that oversee these stories before they go out. Sometimes just simple stuff that if a woman had gone through the copy or the headlines, would have caught the whiff of sexism and misogyny straight away. But that does not mean that men cannot do our own part as well. Being gender sensitive is not limited to any gender, sexual orientation, age, class, or ethno-religious background. So how can men do this? I think we can wait until the question is answered, and I would also love to hear from our panelists later. But I think first I would like to address just specifically on when it comes to publishing news. I think there needs to be more coverage, more elevating of female voices, especially when quoting newsmakers, be them politicians, NGO activists, subject matter experts like lawyers, academics, political analysts, and even when doing vox pop on the ground. And I mean, I myself struggle when assigning these stories on how to keep this gender balance, like who to interview, because admittedly, there are many reasons to this, but the main, I think, the chief complaints to this is that people think they do not know many female experts, and I think this is not very accurate, but largely because the space has been dominated by men for so long. And perhaps, if I may, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight this initiative called 50-50 Malaysia. It's spearheaded by a journalist, my respected friend Tashni Sukumaran. It aims to provide a database of female subject matter experts that can be contacted and quoted by media and also students, academics. I think they are still building their website, but if you are in the audience would like to keep updated about it, you can go to their Twitter account. It's at 5050 Malaysia. And of course, if you are a female academic, female expert, I implore you to join this initiative and database so more of us in the media can get these female voices out. And I think as an ending to my intro, I think I would like to take this opportunity because Senator Ras Adi Barazi, who heads the State News Agency Bernama, has been our keynote speaker earlier this morning. I would take this opportunity to plead with her to inculcate gender sensitivity among Bernama staff and to use correct pronouns for transgender subjects. I think for too long, we have seen Bernama stories referring to transgender subject incorrectly, even using their dead names from their official documents, which, as we may know, it's already hard for them to change. And what this does is that all these Bernama stories are being used by a lot of a lot of news organizations. So just by this simple fix, we can already fix these incorrect reports in most of our newspapers, most of our online portals, because most of us use Bernama in one way or another. And I think that's all for me for now, and we can hear more about this later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Zurairi. I totally agree. We need more media representative in gender stories. We need to break the gender stereotypes and transform gender stories to make it more inclusive, because media is a very important medium that actually bridges the community. So thank you so much for that valuable speech. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nurul. He is a UNFPA Malaysian consultant that focuses on religion and the inter-religious dialogue. So he'll be speaking on gender equality, but within the religious context and gender justice between male and female. So hi, Dr. Nurul, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. Okay, today I'll be talking about gender justice. I prefer the term gender justice as opposed to gender equality. The first word is gender, which is a lot of us confuse the word gender for, confuse the word gender for sex. This understanding should be corrected, because in this regard, gender refers to the roles of women and men of all ages, which are defined culturally, socially, economically, and historically. And these ideas vary across cultures. So gender itself is a term that evokes various debates and controversies. At a minimum, to use the word gender rather than sex is to indicate that male and female roles in a given society are shaped not only by biology but by social practice, and that the roles of women and men will not be identical in every society. And this brings us up to the concept of gender justice that teaches our equality hinges upon dignity as a human person. Because in faith tradition, theologically speaking, that we are all
Oh, I think there's some technical issues. We can't hear your mic. Dr. Nurul?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I was
No
saying that,
worries.
yeah, I was saying that this brings us to the concept of gender justice. Okay, that teaches our equality hinges upon our dignity as a human person. In that regard, we are all equal. There is no difference in that regard. And men and women have the same dignity and are of equal value in the eyes of the Creator. Okay, so respect for the human person entails respect for the rights that flow from his or her dignity as a creature. And these rights are prior to society and must be recognized by it. In Malaysia, I would say the exercise of this equal dignity of a human person, male and female, and the rights that flow from it can be translated by allowing Malaysian women, for example, to share the same rights as Malaysian men, to confer Malaysian citizenship on their own children when born to a non-Malaysian spouse. Okay, we could take our cues from the Majalat al-Ahkam al-Adliyah, that is the civil law formulated at the end of the Ottoman Empire based on the Hanafi right. Okay, Hanafi is one of the four Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the four mazhab, school of thoughts of Sunni, and it is perfectly acceptable for us to follow any of these four rights. Okay, for example, in Article 52 of the Majalah, it states that if an original ruling becomes inoperative, an alternative is put in place. What does this mean? Is that in every situation, it has an original ruling derived directly from Islamic text, either from the Quran, from the scriptures, from the hadith, or through ijtihad. That means through juristic exercise of the scholar. If it is impossible to enforce this ruling for any reason, then an Islamic jurist, okay, or a judge, the qadi, is required to find an alternative ruling to implement it in its place. Okay, and the juries should issue a verdict of fatwa for implementing this alternative ruling instead of the original one where it is inoperative. If we apply this to the question of nationality, the original ruling is that nationality is passed from a father to his children. And if this is impossible, either because of the father is unknown or stateless, or his nationality is unknown, then we must have an alternative, which in this case should give the children their mother's nationality. And because of the absence of Islamic text or an explicit rubric on this matter, then it is perfectly acceptable for us to apply this ruling. Okay, only in this way can the children, in this case, acquire their legal status, which is absolutely essential for everyone. And it is only Islamic to do so. Indeed, the legal status of everyone is derived from the fathers or the mother's nationality. This example clearly demonstrates that to be equal does not have to be the same. Okay, it means providing everyone with the full range of opportunities and benefits as their natural rights, and these rights must be exercised and protected by the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nurul. That was a very enlightened speech on how being equal doesn't necessarily mean we are the same, but it's on having the opportunities that we deserve that is rightfully ours. So thank you so much. So I will introduce our next speaker, our third speaker for today, Ms. Nailah Huda. Ms. Nailah Huda is a broadcast journalist and a news anchor with Astro Awani. She'll be focusing on the structural issues present in newsrooms. Hi there.
Hi, Aina. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very honored to be a part of this panel surrounded by such great men in their respective fields. And I think this is probably the only time I'm willing to forgive such a male-dominated panel or panel because we're discussing about, the role of men, which is important. The choice of topic today is really interesting and I think draws out the two most important elements in truly advancing healthier, better social values, especially on gender in society. And, we see the role of men and media, they tend to intersect a lot when newsrooms and C-suites in media, in the media industry are still dominated by men, as Zurairi has described just now. And, when headlines tend to come from a man's point of view, this perpetuates dangerous gender stereotypes and then therefore birthing another generation of kids with the same values. So how do we break this vicious cycle? All right. And there are multiple factors to this. I think Zurairi, having had a much more vast experience in news, is able to speak a little bit more on the editorial level and how to develop more diverse newsrooms. But, me being a measly entry-level reporter and anchor, just, having had 2 years of experience in the industry, I want to speak from my experience and talk about the role that reporters can play too. So how is it that we still see headlines perpetuating gender stereotypes, dangerous ones in this day and age? And aside from the editor's role, I'd like to also see change from the bottom up. Where reporters can take the initiative, challenge narratives, bring forward a new manner of questioning that's more in line with the, younger generation and, the progressive ideas that we see today. But why is it that reporters can't do this? What I see is one, newsrooms now have to move quicker than ever, chase after ratings and clicks, which at times, unfortunately, means compromising quality for quantity. And two, reporters are just stretched thin, having to take on an increasing number of roles, from social media to video editing, for example, and all the while still underpaid. Same goes for editors too, who they are also increasingly pushed to chase after quality over quantity, and all of which just does not leave room for them to understand truly the context of their stories. What are the consequences of their headlines? I'm not so much justifying it, but rather trying to get you to understand what exactly happens from a reporter's perspective. And these are all also very structural issues. Much like anything to do with gender, most issues, it usually always boils down to how, profit-making, money-making machines and institutions, they tend to triumph over social values. And another issue I also find is interesting to highlight here is how I see there's this growing gap in values and ideas between English and Malay language content. Despite my own personal preference to speak in English, I made the decision to improve my Malay just so that I could inform and educate and speak to a much larger Malay-speaking audience in this country. And much like this forum too, and a lot of intellectual discussions like this, I wish we could also have more forums like these in Malay, which I think there's a much more pressing need for our Malay-speaking population to hear these kinds of discussions and narratives. And I also want to see the younger generation championing these values and ideas, but even much more so in the Malay language. I think we all know the old tired trope of the bangsar bubble, right? And to some extent, I do see that some of these discussions exclude the Malay-speaking population. So there are, at the same time, obviously a lot of efforts to spark these kinds of conversations in the Malay world, but in media, in newsrooms, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. So moving forward, what do I want to see happen? I want to see more support for reporters through, maybe stronger unions or councils so that they're better paid and they have better working conditions and better working hours. For newsrooms to invest in training for reporters, working with perhaps, civil society, experts, those on the ground who know and understand deeply gender issues to explain, deeper context behind gender issues and stories that they put out, especially gender sensitive issues like sexual assault, prostitution. To put quite simply, I think reporters generally feel like they're not paid enough. They're often just too tired. And most of all, they lack the resources and support to understand the deeper context of stories. That's why I don't think breaking the glass ceiling or the glass screen in the broadcasting world is enough on its own. Putting women in senior positions sometimes only places them within existing structures where we know workplaces were originally built by men and for men. So especially in my own experience, I sometimes see women themselves perpetuate these gender stereotypes that can harm other women. So we need to restructure the newsroom in a lot of ways, and constantly train and educate reporters and editors as well, particularly in Malay language organizations, to keep up with the times and progressive ideas. We forget that news isn't just to inform the public of what's going on, but it's also to educate. And at times, editors and reporters themselves can slip through the cracks, and we need to better equip them, not just to name and shame them and hold them accountable after they put out a headline that perpetuates these stereotypes. But let's prevent that first from happening, and seeing that there are a lot more resources for this in the English-speaking media. There's a whole vast world out there. Perhaps, I can also like to see that there's more collaboration, bridging this gap between English and Malay organizations, perhaps even with other languages as well, to close that gap on intellectual conversations that work together to advance better and healthier social values, particularly on gender. Thank you.
Thank you, Nailah. I do have a question though on bridging the gap between the Malay speaking and the English speaking. Is there a particular, in your opinion, do you think there's a particular reason why there's this big gap? Is it because they prioritize more on English speaking people to digest world problems better? Or is it because for Malay speaking, they don't necessarily want to hear these types of issues, like as you mentioned on like sexual harassment and assault and rape? Yeah.
It's really structural, and I could go on for a long time discussing how this stems from education, stems from the resources that we have discussing these issues, the access to get these kind of resources. We need to start from educating children in schools to discuss about these ideas more openly. That's also another thing, like freedom of speech. I feel like in the Malay news organizations, in that kind of media, there's definitely a lot more pressure to toe the line on certain issues. There's a lot more watchful eyes as opposed to English news. So the kind of pressures that you face in sort of the Malay speaking world and the English speaking world is very different. I feel like it's just growing more polarized. So bridging that gap is very important. But to speak about where it stems from, I think it could go as far as education and the education system itself, how we need to start from there, really, to start exposing the younger generation to these kind of ideas.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nailah. I think we can jump into this topic again in our discussion later on. But yeah, thank you so much. And I think that was a very good explanation, shedding light on these, I guess we can say, privilege gaps. So I'm going to be moving on to our fourth speaker of the day, which is Mr. Tharma, the co-founder and advocacy director of Undi 18, a movement advocating for democratic empowerment for Malaysian youth. So let's hear what Mr. Tharma has to say on recognizing women in political spaces. Hi there.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to speak on a topic that's very important for Malaysia. So what I'll touch on really is about, I think, the most structural ideas or representation about leadership and about decision-making powers within Malaysia, because I think that's very important in order to implement policies that work and implement gender-sensitive and gender equality policies for Malaysians as a whole. Right. So firstly, let's talk about the issue that we have right now, where women, there is a lack of representation by women in politics and also decision-making spaces. So Malaysia continues to rank poorly in global indexes for women's political representation and gender equality. So, for example, under the 2020 World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, Malaysia is only ranked 104th out of 153 countries within that index, a really poor standing. As of 2019, there were only 33 women in federal parliament, which is about 14.9%. The ratio of women to men in cabinet has reduced from the PH era, which is 18%, to currently within the Perikatan Nasional era to only 13%. So even within that limited space, because even 18% was not a good number, but we've regressed further, and women's representation has only been at 13% right now. And all these things is in a backdrop of the reality that women make up 50.58 of registered voters, right? So women are the majority of voters, but the majority of candidates are men, 612 men to 75 women. So when it comes to for state seats, it's even worse, the disparity: 1,470 men to only 176 women. So I think these are the disparities that exist even at odds with the realities of our population in Malaysia, right? And I think that this needs to be addressed. So for me, I think in terms of trying to identify these issues and trying to solve it, I think we need to think from a larger perspective and try to look at what are the structures, whether it's political, whether it's government, whether it's policies that continue to push or cause this lack of gender representation. So firstly, I think to look at what are some steps to address these problems, I think we can definitely explore things such as gender quotas, because gender quotas could be seen as a fast-track solution to produce the 30%. That's always the magic number that people keep using, especially in within developing countries, to improve women's representation. So that's been proven in various studies to be quite effective. So even within our local sphere, we've seen that, for example, in parties like Parti Keadilan Rakyat, where the party constitution itself has a commitment to gender equality and to attain a 30% representation for all levels of Malaysian government. And what's the result? We had our first Deputy Prime Minister who was a woman from Parti Keadilan Rakyat. Some other solutions are, for example, the enforcement of reserved seats for women within central boards of parties and selections. And I think something I'll talk about a bit later also is to review, is our current democratic system something that makes sense, right? Because we currently have a first past the post system, whereas are there other alternative systems that might ensure better representation, not only for women, but also for other underrepresented communities? For example, young people, Orang Asli communities, minority Indian communities, etc. Right? So these are the kind of conversations that we should have in terms of looking at structural ways or structural reforms that will, in the end, directly impact the women's representation and also the number of women decision makers in these spaces. Right? So what are some things that my organization, Undi 18, has been working on? So over the past year, riding on Undi 18's momentum, so we are pursuing other relevant advocacies to produce or to promote a youth-centric agenda and reform. So some of it are Undi Saksama, to talk about gerrymandering and malapportionment and eco-democratic representation. My Hutan, to ensure financing for forest conservation. Senate 18, to lower the minimum age to become a senator. And I think the most relevant one is the 111 initiative, where it's a campaign to build towards 50% women's representation in parliament and politics. So what are some things that we've been working on, I think, in particular, to push for this? One is we believe that there is a value to create a women's parliament caucus. Essentially, women parliamentarians that are there right now work together to develop better policies or to push for certain policies. For example, the sexual harassment bill or other types of bills that that significantly affect women. So I think that's one way that we can look at it. The second thing, I think, a very important discussion to have is the first past the post system the best system in terms of empowering minorities and giving better representation? Because many would argue it's not. For example, one alternative is to have proportional representation, right, where you can have a party list and ensure that certain women are being represented. And lastly, I think to address this, there is a value to looking at capacity building for women in terms of these leadership structures and political structures. So parties that have done that well, for example, DAP and PKR, where they have their own academies to train women to get positions of leadership. And I think these are things that are quite important and quite useful in breaking that or closing that gap between women's leaders, women's central leadership, and also the national federal level leadership. Yeah. So I think that's the idea so far from me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Tharma. That was a very comprehensive discussion. I very much appreciate it. I learned a lot from it. So thank you, and I will jump to the last speaker, last but not least. We have Mr. Rizal. He is the organizer for Men Against Toxic Masculinity, also known as MAT. Hi there! Mr. Rizal will be discussing Hi, Mr. Rizal will be discussing on what toxic masculinity is, how it means to be a good man, and shedding these layers of masculinity that's right now present in society. So
yes, thank you very much, Aina. For my 5 minutes or for my introduction session, I'd like to read a letter that I write for men and boys in Malaysia. And it goes like this. Dear men and boys, stop idling by and watch as women fight vigorously for their rights, for their gender justice in Malaysia. But wait, sure, not all men are in bystander mode, right? Unperturbed, undisturbed by the state of inequality in Malaysia. You have me, you have Zurairi, you have Tharma, you have Dr. Nurul just now. In fact, some men do fight for women's rights and advocate for gender equality in Malaysia. Yes, I hear you. But the issue of attaining gender justice in Malaysia is not only an insulated women's only issue. The issue actually requires us men to actively participate and change our ways too. Men in power need to objectively look at women's potential and contribution. Seriously. And this requires us to be better men. How? It starts with us. We have to have a thoroughly honest reflection of ourselves, replace toxic masculine traits. Toxic masculine traits such as, to be a man, you need to be dominating. To be a man, you need to be macho. You cannot sound like how I sound right now. So to be a man, we can't be all soft and caring. We need to be macho. This step of shedding the toxic masculine layers is what I call shedding the toxic masculine layers. Why shedding? Because imagine our fine self today is this onion. Yeah? Imagine this onion. Hey, here onion. Our worldview, such as man has to be tough, have to sound macho, represents each and every layers in this layer, in this onion. So one layer is men have to be tough. Another layer is men have to be macho. Men cannot cry. Another layer, and so on and so forth. So how do you shed this layer? Is we need to throw away all these toxic masculine traits and get to the heart of your own self. Get to the heart of your own male self and ask yourself, reflect, and then ask yourself how to become a better man. Take away all the toxic masculine layers and supplement it with better layers now. So what are these better layers? These are one layer that I like to say is, I'd like to touch upon is being kind. Being kinder to yourself and to others. Not just because it's appealing or it makes you a more eligible bachelor. No, but this layer, being kinder to yourself and to others, is just the right to do as a new and improved man. But just revamping ourselves won't do. We need As men, we need to start positively contributing back to society in relation to gender justice. And how do we do this? 3 steps. Be a better dad, be a better friend, be a better decision maker. So being better dads means positive parenting. This will help your children, boys and girls alike, to be better, kinder, and a more respectful human being. Respect towards the human person, as Dr. Nurul said earlier, right? Don't dismiss your children when they ask you questions. Take the time to explain things to them. Don't beat your kids. In fact, teach them through fun games and other positive methods. Don't beat your wife. This goes without saying, right? Be a better friend. There's no need for encouraging toxic behavior among your friends. You're fine without participating in the locker room talks. You're fine. Don't worry. Trust me, your manliness will not be affected by your absence from locker room talks. And the third one in being a better friend is find better quality men to surround yourself with. Men who respect others. Men who are not afraid to be vulnerable. Your kawan sampai akhirat friend. Yeah? No such men, don't worry. You have 3.5 billion men in this world. You can find those men. Yeah, be a better decision maker. There's ample evidence, like Tharma mentioned earlier, that shows that men dominate the decision-making sphere, be it politics, corporates, or even media. But as men, don't take advantage of this situation in the form of perpetuating sexual violence, bullying in your own workplaces. Do take advantage, however, in the way that celebrates, empowers, and encourages women's participation. Take women's ideas seriously, objectively, set up proper structures in your own offices to support women's leadership in your own spheres. Last but not least from me is enjoy your journey in becoming a better you and a better man. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rizal. That was a very, very heartwarming letter. I'm sure everybody in the audience enjoyed it as well. I also want to raise a question for everyone, actually. Oh, but particularly Mr. Rizal, because you touched on the topic of toxic masculinity. Why is it that males, men and boys are so reluctant to actually practice gender justice or gender equality? Why do they reject the term toxic masculinity?
I like to bring myself back to this onion.
Okay.
So in order to get to the heart of a man, right, you have to peel all the other layers here. I don't know if you can see the layers, but basically there's millions and hundreds of layers here. So to do that, like, you take a lot of time to just peel off just one layer and another layer. I know as organizer for MAT, Men Against Toxic Masculinity, I organize a few sessions where we men can reflect on ourselves and then talk about what it means to become a better man, so on and so forth. So in our effort, it's like taking 5 or 6 men to change just one onion, to change just one man, right? But what if we can change in the way where we influence parents, teachers, or associations to start teaching their children to become better men? Then you have one-to-one mentorship or leadership. It's easier to change and it's more effective to influence more men in order for more men to not be reluctant anymore, to shed more of toxic skin.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rizal. I do want to basically stretch out more our discussion on what programs and policies that need to be implemented to end structural inequalities. Maybe Dr. Nurul or Mr. Tharma can give your opinion on this. What programs and initiatives we can do besides the one that is currently here. So maybe something that's more towards law-based. Are there any present laws right now that discriminate on the basis of race or gender?
Yeah. Maybe I can jump in before Dr. Nurul, because I'm sure he has some brilliant ideas. So for me, I think it's about looking at it from essentially looking at how can we eliminate discrimination or in certain cases promote greater representation, or at least more proportional representation of women in these structures of power, right? So one thing in terms of eliminating discrimination, I think Dr. Nurul rightly pointed out was, for example, in terms of constitution itself, is our constitution gender equal, right? Is our language used, biased towards men, or is there equality within our constitution itself? Are our laws worded in ways that promote and encourage gender equality? Can that be justified in law? Like, for example, if let's say a woman is being discriminated, can she use the law to sort of like sue against certain companies or against the government for being unfair against her? Because in reality, right now in Malaysia, even our structures, our legal structures itself, are not written in a way that is gender equal. So I think changing those legislations, whether it's the advocacy by groups like FSSG, where they're pushing for the constitutional right for women to grant citizenship to their children, right? So I think these are important conversations that should be there in terms of the law itself. The second part, as I mentioned earlier, is about not only having a gender equal policy, but actively promoting and introducing structural reforms to push greater women's representation in spaces that there aren't. Because Malaysia is not unfamiliar with affirmative action. We've already had the NEP to improve Malay representation in terms of the economy. I don't see why we can't have similar types of policies for women to increase representation in these spaces, whether it's decision-making processes, in politics, or even in economics.
Thank you, Mr. Tharma. Dr. Nurul, what is your opinion on, because in Malaysia, we have both the Sharia law and also the Malaysian court law. So how is it that these laws actually discriminate? And if they do, like on the basis of gender, they actually prevent women from getting justice or feeling brave to come up with whatever that has happened to them, any form of violence?
Okay. Basically, I would say it's not just a gender issue. It is more than that. It touches on religious sensitivity as well, because our constitution, the ninth schedule, item one, list two, state list of the ninth schedule, it gives the punitive power to the Sharia courts to punish Muslim offenders for acts that is against the precepts of Islam, which are not clearly defined in the federal constitution. Okay, and but these are left to the individual states to interpret what are those offenses, or what is meant by precepts of religion. And because there is no directional tone set in the federal clause, this leads to arbitrary and abuse of interpretation, and most of the time, mostly women and children are the victims. We can see in the case of Indira Gandhi, for example, and also the recent one, apostasy, Rosalita Ibrahim, if I'm not mistaken, that she was born out of wedlock to a Muslim biological father and a non-Muslim Buddhist mother, and for whatever reason that is unknown to us, I mean, she was registered as a Muslim. And because of this structure in our federal constitution, it does not help the people, in this case women, to achieve justice that is one of the paramount teachings of Islam. So these, from my opinion, I mean, in my opinion, I believe these clause, these what they call it, lacuna, loophole in our legal system needs to be addressed. The ninth schedule must be amended accordingly so that Islamic justice can be established as it is. And of course, this requires a lot of efforts, a lot of advocacy, a lot of understanding and awareness needs to be done on what has gone wrong and what needs to be corrected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nurul. So to reiterate, there are some misconceptions and myths when it comes to how Islam is portrayed in terms of gender justice.
For your information, the Sharia law is a public law. It's a public law, and as a public law, that means it's a law of the land. It is applied to everybody, Muslims and non-Muslims. But what we have now in Malaysia, it is only confined to Muslims. So the justice cannot be dispensed. With this clause, the justice cannot be dispensed. So it is important that we need to amend the clause so that justice can be dispensed and exercised according to the divine mandate. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I also want to have our conversation lead towards how inequality is present in the workplace, especially Nailah and Mrs. Zurairi. You mentioned about how reporters are affected. They're limited in being able to spread more gender-sensitive content. Is there a particular reason why? I know you say they're overworked and stuff, but is there a fear in them also to be able to stand out and be empowered to actually fight against content that are being controlled?
Nailah first.
Zurairi, you like to start?
Anyone?
Sure. I don't think it's so much of fear. Fear, I think, comes when you're discussing probably other issues, political, religious, those a lot more scary topics to talk about as a reporter, understandably. But when it comes to gender, I think there is room to push the envelope and to push new and more modern narratives. But it's not so much fear for me. It's there is room and there is support. I think a growing support, especially in the Malaysian media environment, where you can see a sort of a new wave of reporters and journalists, especially female journalists that I look up to myself in the industry, that are there to support you and your voice. But it is, I think, still down to resources for me. I work in a much more Malay-dominated, Malay-speaking news organization, a Malay language organization, and I feel the difference when I see English language content as well, which is why I stress on this kind of collaboration, which there is a certain element of fear, I guess, when you compare the Malay and English language organization, which I'm not sure why. Like, I think it's also a matter of, is our society ready to discuss about these things? A lot of gender issues touch on sensitive stories like rape, sex, sexual assault, which are all very much taboo in our society, being in Asia as well. And so being in the Malay language organization as well, it is a sort of a certain taboo to be discussing these things. Certain things like, sex education is still, I know some people are not open to discussing these things in public, in media as well. So there is a certain element of fear, which I think is sort of like a chicken and egg situation, right? Like, should we change society first to accept these views, or should we start with the media? But being in media, I feel the responsibility and I want to take the initiative to educate and inform the public on these things. And, we need to work hand in hand together. And in terms of changing, the society's views regarding these gender stereotypes, it not only falls on the shoulder of the media, but also in education, in politics. We want to see politicians have better discussions and not push gender stereotypes in their rhetoric. And so it requires everyone's cooperation.
Both,
really.
Every part needs to play a role in this.
Yeah, there is a certain element of fear, a little bit, I guess, in discussing these areas of the subjects and stuff. So.
Thank you. There's actually a question that I hope Mr. Zurairi can answer. It was appearing on the screen just now. Okay, this one. Traditionally, hierarchical power structures are everywhere, at the workplace, in politics, in educational institutes, at home. How do we promote healthy masculinity in the face of this constant barrage?
Okay, I think it goes back to what Rizal was saying on how do one defines masculinity? Because as we have discussed before on um, how it is toxic or not, people perceives masculinity differently. I mean, uh, there is always that sense of one being a superior or guardian or protector, and I think that notion just does not work anymore in modern workplace. So I guess what is left now for male is that there is this opportunity of using your privilege, your status in society to, to recover this gender justice. And I think that's important also in workplaces, in newsrooms, where essentially men should learn how to leave things alone, not to take so much space, and leave the space open for female voices as well. For example, in decision making, right? I mean, we can promote, advocate for ideas from female colleagues, and even stand with them when they are being shut down or criticized simply for one's gender. And I think when you talk about journalism, that privilege is, by being a senior journalist, you can use that influence and your network to sort of like promote. For example, promote up and coming female colleagues who sometimes may be overlooked or even sidelined simply by the virtue of the gender, because they may not have the same support and network that established male journalists have, especially when it comes to offers of collaboration, work opportunities, interviews, and even public forums such as where we are right now.
Very, very true. Is there anyone that would like to also give their opinion? All good? Okay. Do we have any more questions? No, I don't think so. Okay, moving forward. So as we were talking about the terminologies of toxic masculinity, Mr. Rizal, do you have any more to add in the definitions, maybe any myths or misconceptions?
Yeah, I think when we talk about masculinity, wow, my tissue was in the picture just now. Sorry. When we talk about masculinity, the one of the issue that keeps on popping up, like Zurairi mentioned, was what is the definition of masculinity? How to become a man? And a lot of boys actually suffers from this. Like, in order to be a boy or to be a man at the school, when they're still growing up, they have to perform masculinity. And this is called as performative masculinity. This one is very dangerous. I hope a lot more people are more aware about this performative masculinity as a term, because it will help boys to understand when they are trying to perform to be a man and when they are being themselves. And in that sense, it becomes easier for boys to distinguish what's better and what's healthier for them. Yeah. So performative masculinity is a term that is very important for us to talk about. Basically, what it means is masculinity, but on the surface level, on the masculinity on the performative or performance only basis. And I agree with Nailah. We need to have more Malaysian terms for this. One of the problems with regards to understanding masculinity, gender equality in Malaysia is terminologies. I have been involved in a lot of organizations where, my God, I have to look at DBP, Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka, and try to find any sort of, language, but there's none. So we need to improve ourselves in that sense, in terms of adding the vocabulary in Malay.
Very true. Thank you so much, Mr. Rizal. We have another question. How do we create uniformity of laws Malaysia, for Dr. Nurul?
Oh, For me, okay.
Yes.
Well, we need to create a federal Sharia clause, you know, to allow that whenever Islamic jurisprudence remits some issue to the civil law, okay, whenever Islamic law remits some issue to the civil law, the latter is to be observed with the same effects in the ninth schedule, item 1, list 2 of the ninth schedule. Insofar as it is not contrary to the Sharia and provided it is not otherwise stipulated in the ninth schedule. What this means is that whenever the ninth schedule remits some issues of the civil law must be observed and its effect are the same in the Sharia provision. This means that the Sharia grants complete force to the applicable civil laws on matters it cannot enact its own norms. So it has to yield to, it has to remit the whole thing to the civil court. That's how I see it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Nurul. So we are also coming to its there's actually one more question for Nailah. Would love to hear some thoughts on how journalists can improve their representation of women in media.
I think I mentioned a bit in my speech earlier. I stress a lot on training and quite literally just training journalists, reporters and editors as well in workshops. And I think that's just the fastest way, I think, but obviously we need to work together with, senior levels of media companies to see that they actually invest their time, money and effort in having these kind of workshops and, to work together with people who are experts in the areas, gender sensitive stories. We have a lot of NGOs, a lot of organizations who are well aware of these issues, who I'm sure are willing to work together, in putting out more informative and healthier narratives and stories. So one, I would say is that. To some extent, I know I said that I don't quite agree with just simply breaking the glass ceiling and having women in more senior levels, but to an extent, obviously having more female representation in media organizations definitely help, and I've seen that firsthand how it does help to have more women and to discuss these issues and start conversations in newsrooms about putting better representations of women in media, so that not just representation of women on screens and on articles, but within newsrooms definitely is very important. And I think it boils down to those two things because, it obviously starts a lot more. I mean, we can obviously go a lot more deeper and, it's structural as to why, news organizations still can put out these kinds of headlines, as I said before, about, chasing after clicks and how sort of media organizations now are engined more towards, after clicks and ratings and whatnot. And so we need to also tackle that and address that issue at the same time, and sort of reframe the way we carry out news in our country. So not just to simply inform, but to go deeper into the context of these stories and to educate. We, I think, can no longer afford to just see black and white stories on news. There's a lot more that goes into play. And, things like sexual assault stories, prostitution, I think people now are a lot more aware of why these things happen, and it's not just as easy as A did B, but A did B because of this, and this. And so it's very structural, obviously, but I think, there are short-term and long-term solutions. As I said, short-term being training and assisting these reporters, having more representation, and, towards more long-term solutions as well.
Thank you, Ms. Nailah. So to reiterate, the news outlet shouldn't be more neutral in their content in terms like for example, if it was a sexual assault case, a rape, are you saying that it's better for them to be supporting victims?
It's not so much for to achieve neutrality. I think that's also tricky in journalism, right? Can you afford to just be neutral, and what exactly does neutral mean when there's so much more social justice that needs to be achieved in society? Can you afford to just be black and white when there's a lot of gray area that needs to be talked about as well? And so, achieving neutrality, I think, is a myth and is something that we can no longer afford to do in news. What you can do instead is to offer different angles to a certain subject, and obviously be more careful in giving platform to the experts and the people who understand these issues, to better platform these people, and not just to simply allow the space for anyone to speak about these things on such a large platform. Those are things that we need to be more careful about in the media industry. And so, yeah, it's not about just, especially when we're seeing a lot of someone being accused of rape and sexual assault recently. That's something very sensitive, and touches on victim blaming, who's right and who's wrong. Is it just a he said, she said thing? This is where I think we need to equip reporters with the assistance of law experts, experts in gender issues, to know how to portray and convey these stories with a lot of sensitivities. It's very difficult, honestly, as a reporter, to be able to write such a complex issue and to just sum it up in a tweet. It's very hard. So I think that's where we need to help and work together across different sectors.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nailah. We've actually come to the end of our plenary session 3. And I just want to say thank you so much to all the speakers for all your wonderful views and outstanding opinions. I just want to wrap up. So today we touched on toxic masculinity, the terminologies, how to be a good man, how to peel off the onion. We spoke about how there's misrepresentation in media, news outlets, and there's gender stereotype and how we can stop these issues and have women be more present, have our stories be heard, because the violence against women is actually the violence against our right to speak and our stories to tell. And we also touched a lot on the lack of women in political spaces and how some roles are created specifically for women, not for them to go ahead in their career, but for them to stay within their lane. I think that's a common term that most women always hear. And also we touched on about Islamic law and Malaysian law and gender justice, and how treating people with discrimination is treating, it's a hit in our dignity as humans, as creatures. So yeah, thank you so much for such a wonderful forum. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you for your opinions. So I'm going to pass back to Tamina.
Thank you so much, Aina. Thank you so much, panelists. Such an invigorating and essential discussion. Lots of refreshing perspectives as well. And I think it's really important that here we're centering not just what Malaysian youth think, but also at the same time integrating holistic, faith-based perspectives, and also saying this is how big a role the media plays in shaping our daily lived realities. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we are drawing closer to the moment that we've all been waiting for, the announcement of the MWGF 2020 resolutions. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a jiffy.